This is the beautiful land of Israel and Palestine. The world's three most prominent religions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, consider it Holy Land. Each year, millions of people from around the world come here to pray for peace and prosperity. Yet this land is also a major center of conflict in the world today. For Jewish Israelis, the conflict centers on protecting a homeland created for the Jewish people in 1948. For Palestinians, it is about resisting decades of colonialism, expulsion, occupation, and apartheid. Most people identify apartheid with the grotesque system of control that existed in South Africa from 1948 to 1994, in which the white minority ruled over the black majority, stole their land, and deprived them of basic rights. It was a system reviled by the whole world, and it eventually crumbled under the combined pressure of internal resistance and international sanctions. Today, the word is back, and with it too is a growing global movement to end the Israeli form of apartheid.
October 1948, a new leadership. It denies the morality of economic free-for-all. Its slogan, to each his own. Its belief, parallel development, separate identity, apartheid.
The word apartheid, of course, is an Afrikaans word, which simply means separateness, being apart. So we had a wonderful term called separate development. But it was never intended to be equal.
One could talk about the petty apartheid. That was about the fact that almost from birth, your life was separated from people of other races. You'd have to stand if the bus was full. If you went to the beach, there were some beaches you could not walk on. Those were the sort of petty manifestations. But you had the real apartheid, which for me was about the structural systems and policies of apartheid, the way in which land was taken away from people.
In the first post-war election, the white electorate voted into power a group of men dedicated to the complete separation of the races in South Africa.
The vision was to create a demographic white majority, at least of citizens, even though you were going to have the others in your midst. Their entire nationalistic existence was at stake. It was going to be swamped by the black majority. So they evolved the concept of apartheid. Ultimately, the driving force behind it all was to create the white Afrikaner-led nation so that Afrikanerdom could sustain its permanent existence as a national entity.
Now united, the folk would decide South Africa's destiny. The years of division, of second-class citizenship, had conditioned Afrikaners to thinking of themselves as a people besieged.
Afrikaner history formed a sort of self-contained moral universe, whereas the rest of the world saw them as oppressors, as colonizers, as racists. They saw themselves as primarily as victims, settlers who were escaping religious persecution in Europe. They saw themselves as fighting for self-determination.
In 1836, in an extraordinary gesture of self-reliance and courage, 2,000 Boers crossed the Orange River into the wilderness, out of the bondage of British rule.
The first time in history that the term concentration camps appears is in Afrikaner history. About 10% of the population died in British concentration camps. So for them, apartheid was about survival, about self-determination, about redemption, about preserving a way of life. You see a very similar pattern in Zionism. Despite that Palestinians experience it as a very aggressive colonizing movement that has dispossessed them, Israelis are capable of seeing themselves as victims, as survivors, of drawing on Jewish history in order to justify their status quo. It's important to address that. It's important to address them with empathy and to say, I don't accept what you do, but I understand what the motivation is, and to be able to talk about that.
We feel that the concept of apartheid is really crucial for understanding what's happening here and where Israel is going, because it's the only term that accurately defines the system that Israel is trying to develop. It isn't just a policy. It's not just discrimination. It's the way the system is structured. It's a separation of populations in which one group permanently and institutionally dominates another group.
It's getting to the point where there isn't going to be a Jewish majority. If you take the entirety of Israel and the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, we're at the point now where it's roughly 50-50.
And that's before any Palestinian refugees return.
Palestinians are broadly categorized into three main groups. The majority of Palestinians are refugees that were forced out of the land that became Israel in 1948. Today, they number over 6 million people and still live in refugee camps in places like Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. A second group is the Palestinians who managed to stay inside Israel during the 1948 war and became Israeli citizens. And lastly, there are the 5 million Palestinians living in the occupied territories, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip. This territory is defined by what is known as the Green Line. This is land that Israel occupied in the 1967 war and still controls to this day. Palestinians in these areas do not have Israeli citizenship, nor do they have a state of their own.
What you have in the West Bank is two entirely separate and unequal geographies that are superimposed on each other but exist separately. You have the Palestinians who are cut off into dozens of ghettos, literally surrounded by walls and physical barriers, with little access to work, to education, even to the basic means of survival. Food and water is often difficult to come by. And then superimposed on that, you have the settlers who live in what look like American-style suburbs, very spacious, very luxurious homes, with swimming pools, with access to water.
Immediately after the 1967 occupation, Israel began building Jewish-only settlements in the occupied territories and started moving its population into these settlements, a practice that is illegal under international law. There are approximately 220 Jewish-only settlements scattered throughout the West Bank. Their territorial jurisdiction includes not only the Palestinian land upon which they are built, but often the land that surrounds the settlements, which is reserved for their so-called natural growth.
Each of those settlements, every single one of them, is only allocated to Jewish Israelis. Roughly 60% of the West Bank is allocated or controlled by these settlements or the military installations.
What we see in the last 40 years is we see vast Israeli government efforts and vast amounts of public money spent and poured into allocating land in the territories, building settlements on it, and obviously encouraging Israelis to move out of Israel and into these settlements.
Gilon is, I think, a neighborhood where everybody's living, because people have moved out. If you can't afford to live in the downtown in the center of the city, you move out to the new neighborhoods. And you're going to find you have everybody living over here, religious and not religious, more people to the left, people to the right, because most people look at Gilon as part of Jerusalem.
This is Gilo settlement, which was annexed in the 80s and the beginning of the 90s. They start building it in the mid-80s. They start putting caravans, then it started being built until it became a very big neighborhood of Jerusalem, accommodating thousands of settlers' families on Palestinian land. The people there didn't sell the land, they stole it.
There was a decision taken by Israel in 1967 that Jerusalem should be reunited as one city. And part of that political agenda was to establish on the hills surrounding Jerusalem new Jewish neighborhoods in a way that would make it very difficult to, again, divide the city into two parts.
The settlements were not built for security. They were built out of a proactive claim to the country. The words mislead. Not a couple of little trailers on a hillside. These are cities of 40, 50, 60, 70,000 people. They're built over water, aquifers. They're built at key junctions. They're built on certain hilltops. They're built to control movement. They're built to control the border. I mean, every settlement has its rationale.
We can see from here the village. It extended toward the settlement of Ariel, which is located above the hill over there. Ariel, located in the heart of the West Bank, which means 25 kilometers to the east of the Green Line. There is a very important aquifer located on the underground under this area, which the Israelis are stealing. They are enjoying the water. They are irrigating the gardens and washing their cars and playing with the dogs with water. And here we are suffering the shortage of water.
Per capita, Israelis use about 6 or 7 times the amount of water that Palestinians use. And many times in the summer months, Palestinians do not get water, even though it's their water that's being pumped out by the Israelis and sold back to them. They don't get sufficient supplies.
The cut of water in summer means that we will be without water for 3 or 4 months along the year. So we try to compensate that by collecting the rain in the cisterns, in the wells, which it's not healthy. So, but we are forced to use this water, which causes many diseases for the children and for the inhabitants in the village. And my daughter was one case for that. She was infected by some infections because of the water, and she got a kidney failure.
Apartheid was the attempt to separate people and allow resources and privilege and rights to flow to people on the basis of the separate groups in which they were categorized.
And so you have the settlements are very strategic. It's not just real estate. They were built out of a proactive claim to the country.
פה סוף הדרך, פה זה מה שנקרא סביוני חברון. הארמון של דוד המלך, אוויר, עצי זית, עצי פרי. ויש שתי חלונות פונים לצד ההוא של העיר, רואים את כל העיר חברון, אז שכנה שלי קוראת לזה חלונות מוטיבציה. מסתכלים, פותחים בבוקר את החלון, רואים מה עוד יש לעשות. למה כל עוד אנחנו רק פה ולא שם, אז זהו. הבית הזה, בית של ערבים בינתיים, ויש פה עוד בית שהיה של ערבים והיום הוא יהודי. אז עם הזמן התייהד.
Nowhere is the government separation principle shown so starkly as in the city of Hebron, a city deep in the heart of the West Bank with a population of about 160,000 Palestinians. In the middle of Hebron, in Palestinian homes, often vacated under severe pressure, live 600 Jewish settlers, cordoned off and protected by thousands of soldiers. Although neighbors, these two populations live under two separate and unequal sets of laws. Jewish settlers in the West Bank live under Israeli civil law, while Palestinians live under Israeli military law.
ليش اسكر الباب؟ تسجري الدلت تدخليش انت ما تدخلي تسجري الدلت تسجري الدلت ما بديش اسكر الباب رشابت فوق الكلوب يلا وفي يا بيتا شرموطة شرموط خطيفة شرموطة بكل البنات شلخ ديري بالك ديري بالك انت ما تجيش هون بدنا نطلع من برات البيت انت ما لكيش عنا اتركيها مش شايفة شو بتعمل يا خيال اتصلي بالشرطة
The settler population in the West Bank is roughly 500,000. The Palestinian population in that same area is roughly 2.5 million.
So we have a classic situation of really an ethnic minority claiming the entire country, a large territory. And then now what do you do with the natives? What do you do with the whoever you are? In this case, the non-Jews.
In South Africa, the architecture was amazing. First, you give people an identity. Then, of course, you give people pass laws. So you define how they can move freely. And you construct blockages for the movement of people.
Control was exerted through a complicated pass system that determined when and where an African could move. These passes became one of the most detested symbols of apartheid.
The issue of the pass was much more than a question of identity or an identity document. It was a mechanism to ensure the control over people's movement and where people lived.
הייתי פעם גר בשעפאט. תבוא עם ארנונה. תבוא עם ארנונה שכתוב בית חנין. כן? תשמע, ממחר אתה עובר דרך עטרות. תשמע, ואתה מעל גיל 55, ממחר אתה לא עובר פה, רק עטרות. בסדר?
Today in occupied Palestine, Palestinians must carry IDs at all times that essentially dictate where they can live, work, and move. A complex system of movement restrictions requires special permits to enter certain areas. There are over 600 manned checkpoints and physical roadblocks in the West Bank that restrict the freedom of movement of Palestinians. Only 36 of these separate Israel and the West Bank. The rest separate Palestinian towns from other Palestinian towns.
Abuse, beatings, humiliation at the checkpoints is a routine part of the experience. It's part of the systematic disempowerment of Palestinians, placing an entire population at the mercy of 18, 19-year-old soldiers who have absolute power over the lives of Palestinians.
How many is it? Over 60 women who have given birth at checkpoints because some silly kid won't let them through, or taking 20 minutes to let an ambulance through.
شو بدي أفكر يعني ما بفكرش غير إنه في ابني يعني كيف بدنا نمرض بس كنت خايفة عليه يعني من الموت أنا كنت أتخيل دائما إنه بده يموت مش عارف يعني خلاص بدي أصرخ فيهم خفت يأخرونا أكثر بدي أشدهم خفت ياخذوا زوجي يعني كنت خايفة كثير خايفة منهم.
I called him after maybe 5 minutes. Please come here and see my child. He's dying. Please come and see him. He came and he said to me, "Why are you calling? Why are you calling me? Don't call us. I want to check your IDs and to check the cars. After you can go." I said to him, "Nothing here in the car. We are not going from the war. We are going from a house to go to hospital only. We haven't any weapons, we haven't arms, we have not anything. Only we are the four with a child." We reached the hospital, but the doctor said to us, "We can do nothing to him. Your child died about 20 minutes ago."
بس أنا دائما طبعا بيبقى في داخلي غضب كبير ويعني بدي أصرخ عليهم بدي أضربهم بدي شو بدي أسوي يعني.
I have been able to visit Israel and Palestine on more than 2 occasions. And what I experienced there was such a crude reminder of our painful past in apartheid South Africa. We were largely controlled in the same way. The continuous checking at the roadblocks, and to see these young men and young women standing at the roadblock, having to perform the duties of a military junta. These parallels with Israel pained me severely while I was traveling through that lovely country.
The settlements are linked by modern superhighways, which are Jewish-only roads. Palestinians are not allowed to use them. And these superhighways crisscross across Palestinian land, linking the settlements together and linking them with Israeli cities inside the 1948 borders.
The separate roads that you find, the kind of settlement infrastructure that you find in the West Bank, for example, you know, which in South Africa we didn't dream that we'd have roads that would be only for whites.
In 2008, there were 800 kilometers of Jewish-only roads in the West Bank, or as the Israeli military prefers to call them, sterile roads. Settlers are issued yellow license plates so that the military can distinguish them from Palestinian drivers.
אוקיי, זה כביש 443 בין ירושלים לתל אביב. דרך טובה לכל אלה שרוצים לברוח מכביש מספר 1, שחק קצת הפקקים.
הוא גם כביש נוח לנסיעה. אין בו, הוא כביש רובו ישר. לא עיקולים, לא זה, והוא כביש מאוד נוח לנסיעה, וגם מקצר, נדמה לי ב7 קילומטר לבירה. תשים לב, מהמחסום, כולם חסומות. כל היציאות חסומות. עכשיו יש להם כביש מקביל. פה כבישים מקבילים לכביש הזה.
شو هذا اللي بتفكر؟ ولا لحق طريق؟ طريق يعني مش سيارة. لا ايش فيك على السيارة؟ الصنابة اللي على جهة يعني سياراتنا كلبن عربياتهم الشوارع.
The other part of this system is the Palestinian roads, which is linking the Palestinian villages and cities together, but it is tunnels, in the tunnels and bridges under the main network of roads that they are creating for themselves. And this bridges and this tunnels, it has gates, and the gates has locked, and the locks is in the hands of the soldiers. It means if they want to do curfew all over the West Bank, in 2 hours they can do it.
جاء المستوطنون سنة 1987 منعوا السيارات من السير على الشارع الالتفافي والشارع الرئيسي للقرية.
The Jewish-only roads serving the settlement of Avnei Hefetz are but one of the many examples of the segregated road system in the West Bank. Because of the settlement, Israel declared the roads between the Palestinian towns of Shufa and Izbat Shufa a sterile road for Jews only, erecting dirt roadblocks for Palestinians at every exit of the town. Recently, Israel allowed Palestinian pedestrian but not vehicular traffic on the road. Due to these conditions, 1 out of every 4 families has left Shufa.
بسبب انهم منعونا نقطع الشارع نروح طول الكرم، فبنلف في 30 كيلومتر تاني، علما ان المسافه بيننا وبين طول الكرم 7 كيلومتر. شوفي 2000 نسمه، في حين عدد المستوطنين 300 نسمه، بتمتعوا في كل شيء، محرومين احنا اصحاب الحق والارض، محرومين نروح ونيجي براحتهم. المهم في المستوطنين هذول انهم بيجوا هون 300 مستوطن، بروحوا بيرجعوا نهاية أسبوع، بيناموا هون وبعدين بقيت حياتهم بغضوها في نتانيا في تل أبيب إسرائيل. يعني انحرمنا مشان بس متعتهم، يعني يقعدوا هون بس يوم أو يومين.
A deeply religious people, the white Afrikaners of South Africa believed they had a God-given right to a land that they considered mostly uninhabited. In what is known as the Great Trek, what Afrikaners consider their equivalent of the Exodus, thousands trekked into the wilderness in search of the promised land. The Afrikaners pushed into land the Africans considered theirs, and many battles ensued. Armed with guns, and protected by a circle of covered wagons, known as a lager, the Afrikaners easily beat back the indigenous masses that outnumbered them. This image of the heroic settlers in their lager, fending off the savage masses, became the dominant mythology in Afrikaner history, morphing into the philosophy of apartheid in 1948. Under apartheid law, the one standard against which everything was judged was the security of the state, and the state meant the Afrikaner people. With every law enacted, the freedoms of the majority were whittled away in order to protect the privileges of a white minority. In Pretoria today stands a monument to the Great Trek, a shrine to this history and philosophy. A concrete lager, that iconic image of the Afrikaner's military defense tactic, completely surrounds the monument, a physical representation of a state of mind that sees enemies everywhere and will do anything to protect against them.
What I experienced there was made even more painful by the existence of the wall of separation, what we from South Africa prefer to call the Apartheid wall. We didn't have that type of division in South Africa.
In 2002, under the guise of a temporary security measure, Israel began construction of the separation barrier to completely seal off the West Bank from Israel. In urban areas, it is a concrete wall 8 meters tall. In rural areas, it is a smart fence, averaging 60 meters wide, with motion, heat, and vibration sensors, cameras, trenches, patrol roads, and razor wire. To many, however, the wall is not about security. Its snake-like route through the West Bank annexes large Jewish-only settlements, agricultural land, and important water resources, clearly marking it as a tool for massive land grabs. Only 15% of the wall follows the Green Line. Instead, the wall twists and turns deep into the West Bank, making it more than twice as long as the Green Line itself. It separates Palestinian villages from neighboring Palestinian villages, farmers from their land and income, parents from children, and severely restricts Palestinian freedom of movement. It encircles many towns from all sides, creating isolated ghettos surrounded by walls, checkpoints, and Israeli-only roads.
When you put people behind the wall in all of these ghettos, because almost everywhere it is creating ghetto communities with one road or one checkpoint or one tunnel with a gate in it out, then at a certain point there is going to be, when there's not enough work and not enough food, more and more pressure built up. Obviously, a lot of people will leave, and I think that's part of the intention.
Now, in the South African context, the attempt by the apartheid government was to de-citizenize more than 80% of the South African population, and then give them new citizenship in some kind of a fantasy entity, Botswana, Transkei, etc. So the South African state could say, you have no claims over us, you're a citizen of Botswana. Social benefits, etc. is what you should be looking for there.
The godfather of the system was Dr. Hendrik Verwoerd.
In South Africa, you can only achieve peace by separating the nations.
And he spelled out the whole Bantustan concept. He said the black people have got to be given their own countries. They embarked upon this remarkable experiment of trying to cut up the country into Bantustans. And these were created, at least on paper, 10 of them. And the move began to advance them towards independence.
My government would like to continue as we are, an autonomous and independent country, preferably with extended borders, continued friendly and cordial relations with our neighbors, and if possible, international recognition.
Most of them were stooges and really puppets of the apartheid state.
To give some veneer of reality to the fantasy of the Bantustans, the Afrikaner government threw money at them, built elaborate parliaments, housing for ministers, built airports, sports stadiums. It was to create separate states. It was not so much a two-state solution as a multi-state solution. When I look at Israel and when I travel through the West Bank, I was looking at Bantustans, totally unviable, impossible states. In many respects, it struck me as being significantly worse than apartheid.
Bantustans, as much as we abhorred them in South Africa, Bantustan leaders actually had more power and more control than the Palestinian Authority has. What Oslo did was create an authority which allowed Israel to still control the occupied Palestinian territory, but control it through a Palestinian Authority. Ostensibly, there's some kind of Palestinian Authority that's controlling, that's in power of the occupied territory. In fact, Israel controls the borders, Israel controls taxes, Israel controls all kinds of things, access in and out of that area.
To me, the big analogy was that South Africa, in taking these two choices, where you've got two or more nationalisms laying claim to the same country, you either got to find a way to live together or you've got to have a fair partition. The big similarity between apartheid South Africa and the Israeli-Palestinian situation is that both decided to have a partition solution. And in both cases, it was a grotesquely unfair partition.
And this is why Israel says, well, Gaza is not our problem. Gaza is a foreign country. It's not a state. It's not part of any other country. It's just not us.
Just like South Africa, it's the same logic. We need a Palestinian state because we can't digest the Palestinians. We can't give them citizenship, because then it wouldn't be a Jewish state. We have to create a Palestinian state because it's the only way we can get them off our hands. But it has to be a minimized state on as little territory as possible that leaves us in control of the entire country.
South Africa, they were talking about 13% of South Africa to the South African people in cantons, looking them in cantons. Here, when you look at the map, what they are created is about leaving to the Palestinians 12% of our historical land. This is the ghetto state, ghetto system that they are creating here. And it's totally disconnected from each other. We have 1, 2, 3, and the fourth is Gaza.
صار اللي هو يوم سبت 27 كنا نحن في الحلم بقاش يخطر على بالنا انه تصير حرب زي هذه. احنا طبعا ليل ونهار كان القصف شغال، الخبط شغال، الفسفور، ما تعرفش ايش تسوي، كل شوي والثانيه ينزل صاروخ في المنطقه اللي انت فيها، تحمل اولادك وتاخذ مرتك وتجري في الشارع. 21 يوم وانتهت الحرب، وطبعا جينا صرنا نفقد حالنا، اللي بده يشوف مرته، اللي يشوف اولاده، اللي يشوف مش عارف ايش. غرفه واحده جيت طبعا قد بيتي مهدوم، مطبخ رايح، صالون رايح، غرفه رايحه، باب الدار رايح، الحيطان هذا كله رايح، كله راح. واحد من الناس انا نايم في شارع، يعني انا بنام في الشارع.
الحمام كيف ما تشوف غير سترنا بالبطن.
انا يعني انستر ما حدا يشوفني، ما حدا يشوف زوجتي، ما حدا يشوف بناتي. العالم كله طبعا ما شافش الحرب هذه اللي صارت علينا. مرت الحرب على سلام، هلقيت اجى وقت الجوع ووقت الاهانات. يعني تجيب طحين لاولادك ما فيش، تجيب خضره ما فيش، تجيب كله هذا طبعا مش موجود عندي. هذا كله طبعا من الحصار.
Since 2006, Israel has imposed a deadly siege on the Gaza Strip, prohibiting most goods and people from entering or leaving the enclave. The siege has caused an economic standstill in Gaza. The unemployment rate hovers around 40%. On the more ridiculous end of the spectrum of goods not allowed into Gaza are things like pasta and chocolate. Recently obtained Israeli government documents show this to be a deliberate policy. Mathematic formulas were created which defined the minimum caloric needs of the 1.5 million people in Gaza, as well as an upper limit so that food items cannot become too plentiful. In 2009, Israel bombed Gaza's sewage treatment facilities and electricity plants, and now won't allow the necessary parts in to repair them. Restrictions on fuel imports further limit the ability of critical infrastructure to function, while also causing daily, prolonged blackouts. Blackouts can be deadly for patients in hospitals, but more so is the lack of medicine, specialized care, and clean water.
كهرب ما فيش كهرب فيش اكل فيش شرب يعني احنا الميه اللي بدنا نشربها بنشتريها شراء يعني احنا بنتكلم وبنتنفس على الفاضي يعني حياتنا موت بطيء جدا احنا في عذاب الله اعلم به.
In the worst times of apartheid in South Africa, we never had in any of our townships helicopter gunships flying overhead or F-16 type bombers flying over a township and firing or dropping bombs into a township. It didn't happen.
The problem is we don't have other examples to look at now. You could look at perhaps the Warsaw Ghetto as one example of that kind of walled-in and then attacking a walled-in community like that. Maybe a better example is hundreds and hundreds of years ago, where you had walled city-states that were completely besieged by armies, where no one could get out, and food was denied, and if there wasn't a spring within the city, no one had water, and people died. Just like in Gaza, people died from insufficient access to medicine, to insufficient water, all those reasons, as well as by airstrikes. There are a number of people and some governments who have been claiming that because Israel withdrew its settlers and soldiers from the Gaza Strip unilaterally in 2005, that it's no longer the occupying power. But that actually is not the case. In international law, occupation refers to the control of territory by another government, not the indigenous government there. That's precisely what exists with Israel and the Gaza Strip right now. Israel still controls the land of the Gaza Strip, which many people don't know is completely surrounded by a wall very similar to the wall that snakes through the West Bank. It is completely surrounded. The Israeli Navy controls the seas off the coast of Gaza. The airspace is controlled by Israel, which has prohibited the Palestinians from reopening their airport. So Gaza is completely under the control of the Israelis.
The Palestinian Authority can't issue identity documents, passports, permissions for people to come and go, independent of the Israeli Interior Ministry. If you don't exist in the Israeli Interior Ministry database, you don't exist, period.
If you look at the blueprint of a prison, it looks like the prisoners own the place. They have 95% of the territory, right? They have the living areas, they have the exercise yard, they have the cafeteria, they have the work areas. It all belongs to the prisoners. All the prison authorities have is maybe 5%. And you know what? If it's a minimal security prison, maybe they have 1%. That's all you need. You need the walls around, cell bars, you have some corridors, you have a few locked doors, and that's it. With 1% of the territory, you can absolutely control the inmates. And that helps you make the switch. The issue here isn't how much territory the prisoners have. The issue is, can they get out of the prison?
When the majority of world leaders and people who have the power to change things talk about two-state solution nowadays, what they talk about is a Palestinian state that is made of Bantustans separated from each other, a state that has no sovereignty, no independent policies, and has a very much a similar economic infrastructure to the ones that the Bantustans had in South Africa.
The main thing for the world and for the Israelis is to get this issue off the plate. And that's where Israel thinks it can get away with a Bantustan in the way that South Africa couldn't. You know, you can push a two-state solution. That's apartheid. It doesn't have borders, it doesn't have water, it doesn't have access to its greatest economic resource, which is Jerusalem. It's carved into little islands, there's no freedom of movement, there's no freedom of commerce. It's a prison state. And therefore, the essential idea of a two-state solution has to be not only the state itself, but a viable state.
The Israelis have rendered the West Bank and Gaza unviable, hopelessly unviable. I'm saying Israel no longer has that solution as an option. It has made a two-state solution impossible, physically, morally impossible.
It is time for us to go ahead and move forward on a two-state solution. So thank you very much.
You hear all this talk about a two-state solution. You see opinion polls that say a majority of Israelis are willing to accept it and a majority of Palestinians are willing to accept it. But that consensus disappears the moment you try to actually flesh it out in detail. That's why all the two-state solution proposals are extremely vague. Because Palestinians say the West Bank and Gaza are only a fifth of historic Palestine. Why should we give up any more? Israelis say, well, there's 450,000 settlers in those areas, several generations. Why should they leave? The only thing more difficult than trying to live together would be trying to force a separation.
Israel's overall goal has been to create a Jewish state. In 1948, 75% of the population, the non-Jewish population, Christians and Muslims, were expelled from their homeland and never allowed to return for one reason and only one reason, which is that they're not Jewish.
The 5 to 6 million refugees living in Lebanon and in Syria and in Jordan, etc., those are people that should be Israeli citizens, that Israel has kicked out and refused citizenship.
Over 1 million Palestinians became refugees in the 1948 and 1967 wars. By natural population growth, they now number over 5 million people who still await their right to return. Some Palestinians managed to stay inside what became Israel in 1948 and today make up 20% of Israeli citizens.
So in the Israeli state, what kind of rights and privileges and resources are allocated to you are entirely dependent on which ethnic group you come from. You're either Jewish or you Palestinian or Arab, as they prefer to call them. And so you have a situation where welfare benefits for people, for example, are dependent on whether they're Jewish or not. You have a situation where a Jew can't marry a non-Jew in Israel, which is, for us as South Africans, we remember the Mixed Marriages Act, for example. You have a situation where people from one ethnic group, Palestinians, are not able to freely live in areas that are majority Jewish, similar to our Group Areas Act.
Now, one of the criticisms people make when you start accusing Israel of being an apartheid state inside its own borders is that they'll say, well, Palestinians can sit next to Jews inside restaurants. They sit on the same buses. They go to the same cinemas. And that's true. But that's not really the significance of apartheid. The idea of apartheid isn't really about the fact that people can't sit on the same park bench. It was about controlling resources, making sure that one ethnic group had control of resources and the other didn't. And in that sense, Israel has been very, very effective at doing this, what we might call grand apartheid rather than petty apartheid. In the key areas of people's lives, their education, their employment, owning land, Palestinian citizens are treated entirely differently from Jewish citizens. And I think that's one of the reasons why this apartheid comparison can be made.
By far, the most fundamental element of apartheid with both South Africa and Israel is control of the land. In apartheid South Africa, a slew of laws were enacted that designated 87% of the land for whites only. This introduced the oxymoronic term, quote, foreign natives, into the language of parliament to describe blacks given permission to live in white areas. Israel's complex and creative web of apartheid laws introduced equally oxymoronic terms such as, quote, present absentee into its parliamentary language. This was used to describe Palestinians who are actually present inside Israel, but legally declared absent in order to confiscate their land. Through these colonial and apartheid-style laws, over 90% of the land of Israel is effectively reserved for Jews only. Aside from the few mixed cities like Haifa and Akko, most of Israel's communities are segregated along ethnic lines. Israel's 1.3 million Palestinian citizens are restricted to 120 communities that existed before the creation of Israel in 1948 and which have been unable to expand since. By contrast, Israel has created and developed more than 700 exclusively Jewish towns since 1948, but not one new town for Palestinian citizens.
Land laws in Israel, which are very clearly apartheid kind of laws. You can belong in the state of Israel, you could be a Palestinian or you could be a Jew. But if you want to have rights in the state, really you need to be a Jew to have rights. I have no doubt it's a Jewish state, but I do question very strongly whether it's a democratic state. If we talked about an Afrikaner and democratic state, I think most of us would find that a rather oxymoronic kind of phrase to use. So why is Jewish and democratic not equally troubling to us? There are more than 1 million Palestinians inside Israel today, and that's a major concern for Israel. It's very concerned about the demographic growth, as it calls it, the demographic time bomb of the Palestinians inside Israel.
I came to realize that when they talk about the elimination of Israel, it's a demographic thing. That Israel will cease to exist when it no longer has a Jewish majority. In other words, your nationhood depends upon your having either an ethnic or specifically religious majority, permanently entrenched, because of the experience I've gone through in this country, where I saw terrible injustice committed in the name of the Afrikaners' need to survive. I became ashamed of my country, grievously ashamed of it.
The reason Israel has a Jewish majority is through entirely artificial means. The whole framework of Israeli law is designed to prevent the growth of the non-Jewish population and maintain Jewish numerical and political supremacy. And that's the framework in which we can understand everything we see inside Israel as well as in the West Bank and Gaza.
لما تاني خلاص رفعت روح الخاب ما فيش ولا حدا هون يا زلمه فيش ولا حدا وين سمير وين سمير وين سمير شوفي
In occupied East Jerusalem, the battle for control of territory is happening on a house-by-house basis. Israel goes to incredible lengths to manipulate demography, as can be seen in the stark but complicated case of the city of Jerusalem. East Jerusalem differs from the rest of occupied Palestinian territory in that Israel unilaterally declared it a part of the State of Israel following the 1967 occupation of the city. No country in the world has ever recognized that annexation, and it is still considered occupied territory by the Palestinians and by international law. But by building the wall and the vast settlement blocks around it, Israel has illegally severed it from the West Bank. Over 250,000 Palestinians now find themselves on the Israel side of the wall. Palestinians of East Jerusalem are not citizens of the country, cannot vote in national elections, and cannot live in Jewish West Jerusalem.
A Palestinian can live in Jerusalem all his life, was born here, his father, his grandfather, and generations before, but he will be a resident. A Jew from Russia can come today to Israel. He doesn't know even one word in Hebrew, and in the same day he is a citizen. There are many conditions to be a resident. If you, for example, live in Jerusalem, but you work in Ramallah, in Bethlehem, or in the occupied territories, they say the center of your life is there, and we can take your ID. This is one of the strategies to make the number of the Palestinians more small. This is the booklet, an official one from the municipality of Jerusalem, from the Department of Planning. And in the first point here, they say is to keep the equilibrium between the Jewish and Palestinians like was in 67. That's mean, look at this, 37, as the government decided. You must understand, if in any democratic country in the world, someone will say that the Jewish will be not more than 40% of the population, we will say that this is anti-Semitism. It's clear that it's anti-Semitism. So why is anti-Semitism in Europe and America if someone will do the same? And in Israel, it's permitted. Why? The politicians are hysteric around this issue, and they try to implement a policy of segregation in order to make the life of the Palestinians so bad that they will decide it voluntarily, alone, to leave the city.
One of the harshest methods used to force Palestinians to leave Jerusalem is Israel's house demolition policy. This policy affects all Palestinians living within Israel's stated borders and even within the rest of the West Bank, but it is starkest in Jerusalem.
House demolitions are part of a system of discrimination that does not enable Palestinians to actually build legally. It's fair to say that it's virtually impossible to receive a building permit, a legal permit to build a house in East Jerusalem if you're a Palestinian.
ما قبلوا احنا إنا بنقدم في رخصة تنهم يقبلوا يعطونا رخصة من قبل 20 سنة. يعطونا رخصة جينا غمرنا وبنينا. ليش ما فيش بطلعش رخص؟ هذا الأرض مش إلك، هذا الأرض مصادرة مش إلك. هذا يعني الله بقول تيجي تطلعوا عفشنا وقاعدين فيه وتهدوا علينا وأولاد صغار وحالتنا حالة. شو بدي أعمل؟ شو بدنا نساوي؟ يعني زي ما خدوا البلاد طردونا زي ما تطرد ذبان عنك، جايين بدهم يطردونا دار يعني. تعملها مشان تهجج الناس، مشان الناس تزهق وتطلع. يعني أنا من يوم ما نهدي البيت لليوم وأنا في الفراش، شو نساوي؟
Wednesday, July 22nd, 1962. The Boers are breaking down our house. 2 bulldozers. And of course, the house crumbled. I felt the pain. It was my blood, my bones, our flesh that was being broken down. No book can describe, no poem can describe the horror, because our houses were not houses. They were human beings. I saw bone and blood and veins and brains.
And of course, when a demolition finally happens, I mean, I can't even begin to convey to you the trauma. You know, and the home is your sacred space. Your whole intimate sphere is in the house. You know, men, women, and children react very differently. For the men, it's humiliating. They can't protect their families. It's an entire financial loss. For women, most Palestinian women don't work outside of the house. So the domestic space is their world. So when a woman loses that, I've seen women go into states of mourning. The trauma is tremendous. The demolition of a home is really the demolition of a family. We estimate that in East Jerusalem, there are at least 10,000 demolition orders outstanding. Houses can be demolished at any time. That doesn't include thousands that have been demolished inside Israel. I mean, inside Israel, there's still a campaign of demolition. There's about 40,000 homes of Israeli citizens who are Arabs that are slated for demolition in the next few years. And this is on the background of 1948, when more than half the villages of Palestine, more than 400 villages, were systematically destroyed.
After the state was created, Israel continued to forcibly remove thousands of its Palestinian citizens off of their lands onto small, concentrated areas. Their villages were bulldozed to make way for Jewish-only towns. This policy still continues inside Israel today, with over 45 Palestinian villages that the government refuses to recognize and which are slated to be forcibly removed in order to construct new Jewish-only towns.
أنا ربيت على وجه الدنيا زي كذا صغيرة وكبرت وأنا تجوزت وجبت أولاد هذول كلهم من عند هذاك البيت لأنه مش معترف فينا ما بنعرف عنه ديري حتى يعني دكان ما في عندنا بس بنروح للسبع بنشتري ومكسارة بنوها وإحنا هان والتنبو هذا كل قرية يهودا هذا بنوها وإحنا كانوا ناس ساكنين وشيلوهم. 50 سيارة بوليس وجو بوليسية وجو بوليسيات شرطيات واحنا اجنا نسوي معهم ليش نبني؟ يطعونا مصاري واحنا نبني يا ريت يطعونا. ودنا نقعد على مجرى وين نروح يعني؟
The apartheid authorities had what they called black spots, incidents where black people were occupying land where the white people actually wanted to occupy. And what they therefore did was to send in the police, send in the military with heavy trucks that would break down the homes of people and that would remove families that have been staying on land for decades and remove them and just dump them.
It was nice in so far until the Afrikaner people started harassing us. They said we are staying nearer to town. We are blacks, we are not supposed to stay there. So they started moving us to Meadowlands.
Because they said we can't stay near the white people, so that they must separate us, we mustn't be together. So they take the place, they give it to the whites. They give us only 1 day's notice. Tomorrow we are moving. The truck will wait outside, and then the soldiers will go into the house, remove the furniture into the truck. Then take you children, put you behind the truck, the mother and father.
They just bulldoze it to the ground. They take the family out, the bulldozer comes.
Land is more than just a possession. Land is something integrally bound in with your identity. It's about your ancestors. It's about a sense of knowing who and where you are from. And in South Africa, that's where the biggest damage has been done. This removal of people off the land. And they put in these God-forsaken places with nothing. And they have to start all over again.
لا كانوا يجوا يهدموا كل القرية يعني والخيام اللي بتشوفون والبركات هاي للمرة السادسة احنا بنبني. صرتوا هادين للمرة الخامسة. يعني شو حوالي مليون وش طب مليون بتخطط وبتعمل شارع اسفلت. احنا سكان راضينا، انتوا يا اليهود انتوا اللي جيتوا علينا، انتوا المحتلين إنه. مش احنا المحتلين لكم. يعني بنعيش وبنموت، كل ما بتهدم دار واحد عندنا كأنك ذبحته موته ويظلوا حي، يعني لا هو حي ولا هو ميت، ميت وحي.
You can shave off my hair. New hair will grow. You can spit in my face. I will find water to wash it. You can take away my clothes and leave me naked. I will find a blanket. But if you take away my house and my dignity, where can I go? Where? There is no pain quite like being unloved, unwanted, in one's own land, among one's own kind. The Jewish people come from that experience. The Jews will always have the right, and I would support that right, for memory and perpetuation. But now I feel it for the Palestinians. I feel it for them, because they are stateless, homeless, vanquished, exiled. You take away my house, you take away my dignity, you take away my love, and you replace it with bitterness, anger, and revenge.
Been at least 100,000 Palestinians, if not more, that have gone through house demolitions. There's a psychologist in Gaza in the Palestinian Mental Health Center who's done research who says that 55% of the suicide bombers are kids whose houses have been demolished. And the house demolition issue is one of the most painful parts of the occupation. If you deny Palestinians a home, and connected to that is a concept of homeland, on two levels you're denying them a home, on the individual level and the collective level. The term we use in Hebrew for our form of apartheid is nishul. Nishul means displacement or dispossession. That's the Israeli form of apartheid.
The escalation of the Israeli measures, the way how they treated the Palestinian before the first Intifada, make it difficult for the people to accept oppression.
In 1987, as the occupation rolled into its third decade, the first Intifada, or uprising, erupted.
People, they go, protest, strike, throwing stones, organize themselves in groups, challenge the Israeli occupation in different ways. The things came from the ground in the first Intifada, where everyone, no matter who you are, man or woman, young or old, you are connected to certain group working in this Intifada. It was amazing how the people, they were organized. The people, they took a stand. They had a slogan, no taxation without representation. The Israeli occupation closed down all the education institutions, from the universities to the kindergartens, for 2.5 years. They were very strong in their reaction. The number of the people they were killed, children, youth, women. Thousands of people they were killed. This is the Israeli reaction. If you visit any family in Palestine, West Bank, and Gaza Strip, at least you will find someone experienced the jail. To go to jail, I don't want to say it's normal, but to be a Palestinian, it's enough. It's enough reason to be in jail. It's part of the daily life in Palestine. Over 700,000 Palestinians experienced the jail since 1967.
Proportionately, there are more political prisoners there than existed in South Africa. In South Africa, we had a campaign against child detainees. In Palestine, you have over 350 children who are political prisoners.
They would take very many of our children away from parents and try and use that to coerce parents to appear at police stations to report.
I remember in 1988, you see prisoners coming like crazy. In a few months, we became 6,000 political prisoners in one jail. And 95% of them, they were administrative detentions.
Administrative detention is the detention, usually for 6 months, but you can extend it, of people based on no kind of legal procedure aside from issuing an administrative order. People are arrested without knowing what they are in for. They've never been charged with anything. The way it's been done by Israel is absolutely in contravention of international law.
I remember in the 70s, there were a famous Palestinian political prisoners. He spent like around 7 years as administrative detention. And it's scary. It's really scary because you don't know. And they use it part of the torture. Sometimes it's the day after, for example, 6 months or 1 year in jail. And you know, this is the last day for you, the day you were released. They come to the jail, they call your name, you collect all your stuff, you were released, you say bye-bye to the prisoners, and you move outside, and the officer comes, sorry, another 6 months, you go back to the jail.
Administrative detention, very similar to the detention without trial in South Africa.
When you are about to be released, they will release you and let you walk a few steps and rearrest you, which is, by the way, another form of torture, because you never actually are sure as to whether you will be allowed, totally released.
I was arrested in 1985, and there was nothing illegal about what it was that I was doing. And they knew that they could therefore not take me to court and charge me with anything. They basically detained us because they could do it.
Why Mandela became the hero of the issue of the political prisoners? He spent 27 years in the apartheid system jail. Right now, we have prisoners, they spent more than 30 years in jail, more than the Mandela. Why the international community is not paying attention for that?
Within 1 year of each other, both Israel and South Africa launched Operation Iron Fist, brutal and overwhelming campaigns to crush opposition to their respective policies.
With the Iron Fist policy, they used to open the handcuffed and take the people's arms like this and break down the bone in this way. I still remember the sound of my friend when they break his arm. The sound still in my ear. I will never, ever forget that.
He went as far as killing very many of our comrades, brutally, acts that you can never imagine.
The South African Defense Forces, as they were called, their army and navy was almost totally outfitted by Israel because South Africa couldn't get weapons from other countries. Israel was one of the only countries willing to break the arms embargo.
Well, the alliance started in earnest in 1973. By 1979, about 35% of Israel's arms exports were going to South Africa. So they became a crucial client and also a crucial source for export revenue that Israel couldn't give up easily. And it involved everything from tanks to aircraft to ammunition, you name it. After 77, there's a mandatory UN arms embargo. Israel violated the UN arms embargo openly, and many Israeli officials are happy to admit that. If you talk to South African defense officials, especially people from the Air Force, they tell you that Israel was an absolutely vital link and was a lifeline for them during the 1980s. After 1977, the ideological component becomes much stronger. The top brass of the two militaries really felt that they were in a similar predicament and that they faced a common enemy. They also had a very similar conception of minority survival. There was a sense that Afrikaner nationalists were similar to Israelis, a beleaguered minority surrounded by a hostile majority. When you look through the documents from the South African Defense Archive, you see that dozens of South Africans were going to Israel on a regular basis to attend a variety of courses, whether it involved submarine operation, anti-tank technology, counterinsurgency techniques, you name it. They really see the PLO and the ANC as one and the same.
The reaction of the government ordering a general mobilization, arming the white community, arresting 10,000s of Africans, the show of force throughout the country, close the chapter as far as our methods of political struggle are concerned. There are many people who feel that it is useless and futile for us to continue talking peace and non-violence against a government whose reply is only savage attacks on an unarmed and defenseless people.
Bombs have exploded almost daily in the run-up to Wednesday's poll, the latest a huge car bomb which devastated shops in the central town of Witbank. The blasts have been officially blamed on the African National Congress.
After decades of nonviolent struggle, Nelson Mandela formed the armed wing of the African National Congress. They turned first to sabotage, then to civilian bombings in order to have their political aspirations recognized.
If this was the work of the ANC, it's their boldest attack to date and demonstrates the organization's determination to carry the guerrilla war to South Africa's major city centers.
The explosion tore apart the bus in the very heart of Jerusalem, killing many of those on board. It was the mirror image of last week's suicide bomb.
I am pained when I read the story of a 65-year-old Palestinian woman who became a carrier of a suicide bomb. And in a note, she indicated that she had to do that because she was trying to save her grandchildren from being killed. And we're saying, what unfair choices to put before people.
Security and terrorism are important issues, but they're symptoms, and they're not independent variables. Israel is a strong party. Once you bring the occupation into the picture, there isn't any more symmetry. There's no more both sides, us and them, the balance that everybody loves. Palestinians aren't occupying Tel Aviv.
And we're pleading that we do not wait for more people to be killed. It is quite apparent that the political authorities will on their own not act. We need to pressurize it.
Despite all its repressive machinery, there's general kind of agreement that it was the international dimension and the internal resistance, the South African Intifada, if you like, that really brought an end to apartheid. You had a mass of people, people's movements and resistance organizations, etc., that were, in terms of numbers of people, quite large, but weak, taking on very sophisticated structures of repression. So a really powerful opponent on one hand and a weak one on the other. It was the international isolation campaign that brought a sense of balance between the two.
At that point, the South Africans actually seek out advice from the Israelis on how to sell themselves in the West and how to improve their image. The South Africans looked to Israel as a sort of beacon, and they didn't understand why Israel had managed to withstand criticism for decades and survive, and why South Africa was failing. A lot of Israelis fear that they may one day be delegitimized in the same way South Africa was.
Boycott, divest, and sanction. Boycott, divest, and sanction. Boycott, divest, and sanction. Israel, you should be ashamed. Killing maim thousands of civilians in our name. Claim you hitting terrorists, but children in your aim. Even murder relief workers, what's spilling from their brain while they tried to drive the ambulance. So they couldn't stand a chance. Even bomb students, hospitals, Mas Rafa and Khan Yunis. Shot them in their back like the cops to Oscar Grant. And in each case, the good old United States sponsored that. $7 million a day that we paid tax, and Apex lobbyists is robbing us. Sometimes it feels like there ain't no stopping this, but now nobody can deny it, cause you made it too obvious. Naked truth exposed like the emperor's clothes.
What we'd really like is for members of the public to realise that they actually have a real positive role to play. They can actually boycott these goods, and we think that, well, we're only individuals, but together when we act, holistically, such as the protests today, and even on an individual day-to-day basis, we can have a real impact in challenging the occupation on a long-term level.
The global call came in 2005 from Palestinian civil society organizations. And the ideal was to craft a strategy that would be a nonviolent means of pressuring Israel to abide by international law, using economic pressure. These campaigns are taking root. They're gaining new supporters every day. The churches have taken the lead in saying, we want socially responsible investment. And that means we want to be sure that none of the companies we invest in are profiting from occupation.
There are many initiatives going around the world for boycotting Israeli goods, boycotting Israeli institutions, and so on. So it's growing in the cultural, academic, medical, even trade unions. In South Africa, COSATU, the main trade union body in South Africa, which has about 2 million members, supported the boycott. There are so many. They're mushrooming, really, in the last 2 years.
This is happening more and more. In North America, you had the Canadian Union of Postal Workers. Prior to that, the Canadian Union of Public Employees.
The incredible growing movement. I mean, I've traveled to literally dozens of campuses around the United States, and there are active divestment groups. There are church divestment movements that are starting and really gaining strength and facing incredible resistance, but they're not being deterred by it.
As our South African comrades and colleagues remind us, their first call for boycott was issued in the late 50s, 1950s. Europe and the West started listening in the 70s, early 80s. So it took them 25, 30 years to get anybody to listen to them. So we're doing much better, they tell us. You're going much faster than we have.
Divest from the apartheid like South Africa. Boycott them like King to Montgomery buses. Show them we want peace, but only with real justice. Be murdering the media and witnesses left. We're gonna stop shopping at all the businesses that invest.
The idea of a one-state solution begins with the notion that no matter how they got there, no matter the competing historical narratives, the country belongs to all who live in it. Let 100% of the people live in 100% of the land, since nobody can agree on how to divide it.
Israel's going to have to stop being a Jewish state. It can't be an ethnocracy, and it has to become a democracy, whether it's one state or a confederation or whatever the arrangement is. That's what's going to happen. And it doesn't mean, I try to tell Israelis, that, you know, everything's lost. I mean, in South Africa, people still talk Afrikaans. They still have an Afrikaner university. They still have, you know, nobody's going to stop speaking Hebrew here. You're restructuring. It'll be in a different, more healthy environment. That's the challenge. That's why I like this one-state idea.
You know, it wasn't only blacks who were freed when apartheid ended. I was freed. We all were freed. We were liberated from this terrible, corrosive vision of trying to build an ethnically pure state.
And decades of apartheid regime propaganda, like decades of Zionist propaganda, said to the people, if you give up control, you will be devoured. You will be thrown into the sea. You will be killed. And so it was very important for the anti-apartheid movement to offer to ordinary white citizens a credible message, an alternative, to say you will not be devoured. You give up the system and you will have a place in the future, and it's an inclusive future.
There's already a one state. It's already one state, but it's a one state living under apartheid. It's how to transform it from apartheid to democracy, where people get equal rights based on citizenship, not on ethnicity, religion, gender, or any other identity.
In South Africa, Saying that the country belongs to all who live in it doesn't magically solve the problems. There are still massive political struggles in South Africa over resource allocation, over the speed of land reform, the speed of economic reform, over affirmative action. Those struggles for social justice continue, but they have to start from the premise that everyone is entitled to equal rights.
But you know, the world doesn't stand still. There are people I meet today in South Africa who don't understand what apartheid was about. They come into a whole new world. So it's not impossible to think of other generations. We must have the ability to think beyond our own generation, to think into the future.
What does it matter if a man is white or black? What does it matter if he's a Jew or he's an Arab? It is possible. Israel, it is possible. It is possible to have peace with Jews and Arabs if the heart is ready, if the soul is ready, if we can transcend these petty foibles of power and pomposity, and we say to this world, it is possible. It is possible.
Labo